Okay, so here we are on the nation state. This is going to be one of the most important concepts for international relations, global politics, because the idea is there a nation state? Now, the nation state is very important. 1648, the Peace of Westphalia kind of created this nation state of the concept where people were putting their allegiances in this nation state that is territory. So when I say state, I'm talking about states as far as territories, not like the United States, Mississippi, Massachusetts, Omaha, no, Nebraska. Who wants to go to Nebraska anyways? But this is essentially very important because, and the idea actually started before that with the Treaty of Tordesillas between Spain and Portugal, where they had to divide up Latin America. And Latin America, parts speak Spanish and other parts like Brazil speak Portuguese. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, do we live in a system of nation states? When you read the book and you read about a Piece of Westphalia and then read more of my stuff and watch my videos, the idea is that there is a nation state, the United States, Russia, etc. But that's somewhat misleading. Why? Because you basically have this idea of a nation state, but it's problematic because there's so many nations within the states and so many nations don't have a state. Also, even though when we get into neo-realism, they presuppose and put the nation state at the forefront of global politics. The problem is that, who hit the United States on 9/11? Al-Qaeda, that's a non-state actor. So there's a lot more going on here. So what do I mean many nations within a state? Well, a state isn't a unitary actor like a lot of when we get into neo-realism thinks. The problem is there's many different groups, ethnic groups, linguistic groups, etc. You look at the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, you look at Ethiopian Eritrea, you look at Somalia, which has different colonizations. And then you look at my area, Latin America. In Latin America, you have indigenous groups. Indigenous groups don't feel like they belong to the state. So here, I took this picture in Buenos Aires. It's a little like Boston to me. It says Santiago, Somos Santiago, right? The Próximo Santiago. He was a Mapuche indigenous person. He was a leader and he was found dead under suspicious conditions, right? Why did this guy die? He drowned, but he was, an expert fisherman and all this stuff. So the question is, did people in the state or paramilitaries kill him? This is a big issue because a lot of the indigenous people don't feel like they belong to the state and actually want to break away from the state, but they won't let them. That is the state apparatus itself. Chile and Argentina, Mapuche indigenous are in both states. So they're kind of spread out and they don't feel like they belong to the state. So, it's not fully one state because there's many nations and many of those nations don't feel like they belong to the state. What's a nation? It can be any kind of identity. It could be like I just said, the Mapuche indigenous, it could be linguistic, it could be like what happened in the former Yugoslavia that broke up in the early 1990s. Probably none of you were even born then. Unfortunately, we're all getting old. But the fact is that it broke up and genocide led. Look at like India, Pakistan, East Pakistan that became Bangladesh. These are all problematic because the idea is there's a nation state, but there's many nations within a state and many want to break away. Quebec, obviously the Basques of Spain is a group that wanted to break away from Spain. Barcelona, which Catalonia, Barcelona, the capital, is actually, had a huge movement to break away from Spain. And should people be able to do that? That's one of the other problems, free will and all this stuff, but states crush independent movements all the time because they don't want to lose part of their territory. If they lose land, they might lose nautical mileage out of the sea because you have that extension of the sea, or you might lose precious resources like oil, natural gas, lithium. So there's a lot of states within that, a lot of nations within a state. Moreover, nations don't have a state. The Roma of Europe, people walk around endlessly. The Kurds, Turkey does not want the Kurds to have a state. And the Rohingya, which I'm learning how to pronounce because by the time this goes out, I hosted a conference on Myanmar. and the Rohingya people are basically stateless. The Buddhist Myanmar, the main government, does not recognize them as legal citizens. So what do you say? And one of the former ambassador, who's a great guy, actually talked about this and mentioned that the Rohingya is basically like the Roma to a certain degree. So this is very, very important. You have the Palestinians. Do they have a state? Is Taiwan even a state? China says it's part of China. So, Hong Kong, as we get into. So this is one of the biggest contentions of global politics. The idea that a state is a state, a nation is a nation. No, it's a lot more complex than that. But when we get into neorealism, and I might as well just jump into neorealism now, it's different from utopian liberalism, which I'll get into, is basically the idea, they live in a utopian idea, which we think that we can outlaw war, and we can create institutions like the League of Nations to stop war. That's why when you see Haile Selassie go up in front of the League of Nations, the League of Nations did nothing after World War I because they were very nervous about Mussolini. Mussolini invaded Italy, and the powers did not do anything to stop Mussolini because they were, where's Mussolini going? Is he going with Hitler? We don't want another war. And there's also racism involved, etc. So that's kind of utopian liberalism, the idea that we can outlaw war, Kellogg-Briand Pact, and other things. But there's another point of utopian liberalism using these institutions. But later on, when we study neoliberal institutionalism, they're not as crazy as the utopian liberals, where they basically think that we can outlaw war. Later on, when we get into it, the neoliberal institutionalists believe that we can use the United Nations and other organizations to facilitate peace. But the idea here is that the nation state is not, and I repeat, not, and this is a course where you do have to take notes. You get to hear my beautiful voice, mellifluous voice for so long, and then you get to take notes because this is all going to be on the quizzes and the exams. And it's very important because this isn't just, academic speak. This is essentially very important to understand world politics, right? Palestine. The Palestinians are a people. Do they have a state? No, not a recognizable state. Taiwan doesn't. This puts a lot of pressure in international politics. So China says Taiwan's not a state. It's part of us, just like Hong Kong. Will this lead to conflict between, say, China and the United States? And that's very, very important. Now, for the utopian liberals, the real diehard liberals, these are people a long time ago, they don't exist anymore, who helped create the League of Nations. The League of Nations actually did some good, and it helped deal with some conflict, so it wasn't all bad, but it didn't stop World War II. And that's what a lot of what we call classical realists before the neo-realists started talking about, anarchy, self-help, etc. And we're going to get into that more. But in a nutshell, I want you to understand the classical realists still was seeing kind of the state as a unit of analysis. That's problematic to a certain degree because, as I said, who hit the United States on 9/11? Al-Qaeda, non-state actors. Non-state actors are very, very important. The IRA, for example. So this is definitely an issue. But the classical realists who were seeing the nation state still came up with the idea, and this is going to be a key point later on, is anarchy. Anarchy is a key point of global politics in the sense that, unlike the United States of America, where it's like, if I mug one of you, you go call 911 and say, hey, get this professor, he's a real weirdo, he mugged me and stole my wallet. There is no 911 internationally. And because of that, we live in a certain state structure that the power only wins. So when you read Thucydides, the Millennium Dialogue, the idea is that just power. So power is what rules the world. So this is very, very important for the more realist thinking. Machiavelli, when you read parts of that, are the same thing. You have to be the lion, strong. You have to be the fox, smart. But at the same time, people forget he also said, never be hated. Why? Because then people overthrow you, off with your head. That happens all the time with revolution. Batista in Cuba, Somoza in Nicaragua, which we'll get into because I lived there for so long. There's coups all the time. And this becomes Myanmar. This becomes very, very problematic not to be hated, because if enough people hate you, just like a theory of alienation, if you alienate enough people, they'll overthrow you. And this is extremely important to understand, because once there's a revolution like Iran, the world completely changes. So what am I doing here? Number one, the nation state is an important concept, not perfect, because look behind me, somos la próxima Santiago. That means basically Mapuche indigenous people in Argentina don't feel part of the Argentine nor Chilean state. This is though from Argentina, and Santiago was from Argentina, although they don't think they belong to the state. So there's many nations within a state. Moreover, to recap, there's many nations: Palestine, Taiwan really doesn't, Kurds, the Roma, the former Yugoslavia. There's just so many nations that don't have a state. And when I say that, about the former Yugoslavia, that was many nations within the state, and then the state completely broke up in the late 1990s. So to see the world in such a state-centric view, like a lot of international relations scholars, and we're going to see in Mersheimer, this becomes problematic because there's just so much more like non-state actors are extremely important. And for the utopian liberals, when you watch that video on Haile Selassie, the former leader of Ethiopia, who was disposed by Mussolini, what happened to him, the League of Nations did not help. Why? Because we live in a world of anarchy. There's no 911. This is the classical realist saying, and we cannot outlaw war. And as when we read Thucydides, this is going to be the Million Dialogue. This is basically saying, what is justice in international relations, and that is power. And then you read Machiavelli, which he was talking to Caesar Borgia. Sorry, my Italian is just way off. Even though this looks like Italy behind me, these Argentinian buildings, they like to think that they're European. But basically, he was talking about putting together Italy, that the leader was too naive, and you have to be a fox and a lion. A good Machiavellian character is Bismarck, who basically through treachery and war, great things in international politics, put together and united Germany. And that's the kind of thinking you need. So the classical realist, which I find the classical realist, when you start reading E.H. Carr, etc., this is a PLS 160, so we're not going to get too deep into it, but we're very richer in their thinking. The neo-realists later take the classical realist idea of anarchy and put it on the system, which we will do a lecture just on that, because it's definitely worthy. So for the first lecture here, thanks for coming out. You have to. It'll be on the quiz. It'll be on the discussion board and everything else. So we will see you soon, everyone, and take care. Even though the pandemic is somewhat over, it's still not over, particularly for the developing countries.